Okay, so you're all very welcome today. I am going to just start by sharing my slides. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So my name is Helen Flynn and I'm Head of Policy Research and Campaigns at Just Fair. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you here for this joint event between Just Fair and the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland. I'm going to be chairing today's session and I'll also make a few remarks here at the start, but mainly I am on chairing duty. My remarks will be quite short. In terms of layout, we're going to hear introductory remarks from each of our speakers, and then that will be followed by a short chance for question and answer. And then we're all going to take a 5-minute break. When we return from the break, we're going to split out into breakout rooms for a discussion of the 4 questions you'll have received in advance. Then we're going to head back into the main room to feedback what we were talking about in our breakouts, and then finally hear some closing remarks and thoughts from our speakers. As a reminder, we are going to be recording the first half of today's session, just the introductory remarks from our speakers, and then I'll turn the recording off. For more about the everyday rights conversation that this is a part of, please do check out our webpage and also the resources page for the conversation. The recording of this session and the speakers' presentations will be available afterwards on there. So do give us a couple of weeks to get all that together. And there's also sign up for our next event on the 15th of October, where we're going to do a deep dive into the overlooked aspects of the right to an adequate standard of living. And Laura, I think you're going to drop some links into the chat there for folks. It's going to be my first plea for you all to please do fill in our feedback form. It hugely helps us to shape these events. And then just before I make a few comments on economic, social, cultural and environmental rights, I'm just going to run through some ground rules quickly. So the aim of these ground rules is to make sure that we're taking a human rights-based approach to our meetings, and that means things like everybody feeling respected, everybody being able to participate fully, and hopefully that we're always working actively to eradicate discrimination. So firstly, safety and well-being take priority. This can look like anything you want it to, but for example, we love seeing all of your lovely faces. But if it's better for you to have your camera off, then please do so. Please make yourself comfortable in whatever way you can. If, for example, you need to leave the session for some reason, please go ahead and do so. You need to do what's best for you. Secondly, we respect and we value difference. We know that the world is made up of many different experiences, many different people, but we think bringing these together adds strength and power to our campaigns and work. So we're really glad to have lots of different viewpoints. Linked to this, all opinions count. We understand that expertise comes in many forms. Some of us have gained our expertise through things that we are living through or have lived through. Some of us have learned about it in the things we've read. And for a lot of us, it's a mixture of the two. So please do bring all your expertise and know that we value it no matter where it does come from. This is a safe space for learning. We are all of us on our human rights journeys. None of us are perfect, but we promise at Just Fair anyway to keep trying to learn and trying to improve and trying to do better. Linked to this, we at Just Fair will also promise to actively listen and improve. And that's another reason why filling in the feedback form is so important for us, because we will take your comments very seriously. For example, the decision to record only the first part is from feedback that we had at previous sessions about people feeling freer to speak if they weren't being recorded in the discussion sessions. Please do be respectful, assume good intent, and although it's much more difficult when you're doing it in an online space, please try not to interrupt, and also try to respond to what's in front of you, not what you imagine somebody may have meant or thought or said. And then finally, share the air, particularly in the breakout rooms. Please do take responsibility for helping everyone to have time in the conversation and be really conscious of who has and who hasn't contributed so that we can hear everybody's voice. So just very briefly from me on context, Just Fair is a UK-wide civil society organisation, and we focus on everyday human rights, which are also known as economic, social and cultural rights. However, we increasingly recognise that enjoyment of these rights is completely intertwined with and based upon the enjoyment of environmental rights. That's something that civil society in Scotland realised a long time ago, and we have been hugely impressed at how the human rights and environmental rights sector is working together in Scotland to better reflect people's actual lived realities. It's something we very much want to learn from and work on improving across the UK, because we do believe that we are all doing really vital, exciting and important work towards the same goal, which is better lives and better planet for everyone. So for Just Fair Anyway, we're here today asking, can we work better together, and what can that look like? Just very quickly, because I've already talked a lot about economic, social and cultural rights and everyday rights, when I talk about them, this is basically what I mean. I mean the rights contained within the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. This in front of you is just a very quick oversight of the main rights it contains in plain English, but in essence, it's about how government and public authorities use the resources they have, ensuring equality for all. It's about the jobs that people do and the conditions in those jobs. It's about social security, including the adequacy of the system. It's about protecting the family, about having a decent standard of living, including clothing, food and housing. It's about our health, both mental and physical. It's about education, but it's also about the colour in our lives. It's about that right to culture. At Just Fair, as I said, we tend to call these the rights of everyday life or everyday rights. Now, there isn't a huge amount in this covenant about environmental rights. There is a little bit on natural resources, but not much. But it's really clear just looking at these rights that all of them rest on the need of a strong foundation of environmental rights. I'm just going to very quickly, before I stopped speaking and hand over to our speakers, mention that the UN committee that oversees the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has little by little been recognising the interlinked nature of these rights and have called on the UK government to account for the environment and climate when it reviews the United Kingdom's progress. On this slide, there is some specific examples of questions that the committee asked the UK government to answer last year. And please don't worry too much about the detail. These slides will be online afterwards, so you can look at them if you want. The really important thing that I want you to take from this is that the arc of international human rights, I believe, is moving towards a more joined up, holistic approach to economic, social, cultural and environmental rights. And that's an approach we're really keen to take too. So I am quickly going to stop sharing my slides and then introduce our first speaker. And we are absolutely delighted to have Elisa Morgera here. As well as being the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Climate Change, Elisa is a Professor of Global Environmental Law at the University of Strathclyde and Adjunct Professor in International and European Union Environmental Law at the University of Eastern Finland. Elisa has advised governments and civil society in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean and the South Pacific. So Elisa, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for this invitation and for holding this really important conversation. Maybe I should also mention that before becoming UN Special Rapporteur, I had the honor to work with the advisory group on human rights leadership through Scotland's First Minister for a few years, and also work very closely and with great admiration with civil society in Scotland, looking at the process following the recommendations of the advisory group on human rights leadership. So my comments will be both informed by my experience in collaborating with many colleagues in Scotland, and of course, my understanding of the international landscape on the human right to a healthy environment. So I'll start from that and the importance of how for decades now, there is a very clear understanding of how every single human right is dependent on a healthy environment. All our political rights, but also our civil, economic, and cultural rights cannot really be protected, let alone fully respected and realized without a healthy environment. And that is also reflected in almost all constitutions in the world. The UN General Assembly recognized these developments in 2022, but it's really important to keep in mind that there was the culmination of a process of existing recognition of the legally binding nature of the human right to a healthy environment on the basis of the general international human rights that protect those rights that are dependent on a healthy environment. Now, what the human right to a healthy environment entails is, I think, that point that you already raised about the holistic understanding of how we need clean air, safe climate, access to safe water and adequate sanitation, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments in which to live. Oh, I'm so sorry, hope you can still live, work, study, and play, and healthy biodiversity and ecosystems for all of us to have our basic human rights protected. And we also need procedural rights, the access to relevant information, public participation in decision-making, access to justice and effective remedies, and effective environmental and human rights impact assessments before decisions are taken that may negatively impact on the environment and also on our human rights. Now, as I was saying, Scotland and the UK are lagging behind compared to the rest of the world, where the human right to a healthy environment is broadly recognized at the highest level of legal systems. But through the process of human rights leadership, we had an incredible opportunity to leapfrog ahead, to learn about what have been the challenges in protecting the human right to a healthy environment in other countries and regions, even when that right is recognized at the constitutional level, to build on all the insights that many UN special rapporteurs and other human rights experts continue to provide on how to better understand the implications of environmental degradation on the protection of human rights, and then develop a really strong, inclusive legal framework in Scotland with the integration of the human right to a healthy environment in the Scottish legal system. I think one of the great novelties and opportunities that we had was also that, of course, Scotland has also integrated the Convention on the Rights of the Child into its own legal system, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child has been particularly active in recognizing children's human right to a healthy environment with a focus on climate change as implicit in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and has developed last year a really powerful and clear general comment that clarifies state obligations to protect children's rights in the context of the triple planetary crisis, and clarifying state obligations to take immediate action to address climate change, to protect biodiversity, to prevent marine pollution, and so on and so forth. So it is basically the strength of the human right to a healthy environment is to recognize that when we think about human well-being and all the ways in which our human well-being is reliant on a healthy environment, we are in fact talking about existing international human rights law obligations. And in some cases, unfortunately, which are very well documented, some human rights holders are found themselves in situations that are more vulnerable to the negative impacts of environmental degradation and climate change. And this is the case of children and girls, the case of women, of persons with disabilities, persons with albinism, older persons. So all of that also means that states have a heightened obligation to protect their human rights and to prioritize the protection of those that find themselves in situations of heightened vulnerability. Recognizing environmental protection as a matter of human rights also means that we can't accept any unjustified, foreseeable infringement of human rights in the context of the decisions that are being taken on environmental protection, and in fact on the use of the territory and natural resources in Scotland. And this is a great barrier and a great protection against regression, and also a great way to support policy coherence across decisions. This really would support, and this is something that we did explore in that process on human rights leadership in Scotland, how important it would be to join up thinking across multiple public policy objectives in Scotland through the lens of the human right to a healthy environment. And so just to conclude, I think we are in a difficult juncture at the moment with some uncertainty about the future of human rights in Scotland. I think we need to cherish and remind everyone in Scotland about what we already achieved through the process of human rights leadership and the development of recommendations on the incorporation of human rights to a healthy environment. Some has already been mentioned in the opening, the coming together of civil society working on human rights and working on the environment. That's a huge progress and something that will make a difference in people's lives on top of what we can achieve in terms of legislative progress. I've also seen that that process has received in and of itself recognition across the UK and internationally. And so that also should be reminded how we were indeed ambitious in how we understood the need to further develop and strengthen the legal framework in Scotland on the protection of the human right to a healthy environment. And finally, a reminder that even in those countries and even regional systems where we don't have the explicit recognition of the human right to a healthy environment, litigation can still happen on the basis of the other human rights that are negatively impacted by environmental degradation and climate change. We see this everywhere. And I think the real opportunity of recognizing a human right to a healthy environment is not giving rise to more litigation, but in fact creating a very clear basis for all sectors of government and society to work together towards gradually building our capacities to better respect the human right to a healthy environment, contribute to that joined-up thinking in preventing any foreseeable violations of human rights that derive from environmental degradation and climate change. So I look forward to our conversation and to see how we can move forward.
Thank you so much for that, Elisa. And yeah, as you say, so much of this isn't about, or hopefully isn't about actually having to take legal action, but about actually preventing the violations happening in the first place. So thank you hugely for that. That was so interesting. I'm really delighted to next introduce Benji Brown, and Benji is a Policy and Advocacy Officer at the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland, where he leads on parliamentary advocacy to secure concrete progress on environmental rights and reduce barriers to access to justice. He has nearly a decade of experience as a researcher and campaigner working on land and resource politics in both the UK and internationally. So I'm going to hand over to Benji.
Thanks so much, Helen. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got some slides to go alongside this. Bear with me. Can everyone see that okay? Great. So yeah, hi everyone. As Helen mentioned, I'm Benji, the Policy and Advocacy Officer at the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland. And just to introduce ourselves, we're a small environmental law charity based in Scotland, and we're established just in 2020 to help people understand and exercise their environmental rights. And we do that through a free legal advice service, through advocating for policy and law reform, and through rights awareness and outreach. And we're also hoping to establish the only environmental law centre in Scotland in the new year as well. So it's a very exciting time to be working in this field. And when we're talking about environmental rights, we're really talking about addressing laws relating to land use planning, climate change, pollution control, and environmental health, as well as nature conservation. And I'm going to try and be fairly concise today, but I'm going to provide a short overview of some of the environmental problems and impacts in Scotland in terms of the violations of environmental rights and what we can do to address them. I'll provide a bit of detail on the substantive and procedural elements of the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, which was due to be enshrined in the Scottish Human Rights Bill. And unfortunately, we had some bad news recently that this has been delayed for the foreseeable future by the Scottish Government. So I'll talk a bit about that political context and thinking about what's next for an enforceable human right to a healthy environment and how we can ensure we have strong rights protections here in Scotland and across the UK. So what are substantive environmental problems? Let's remind ourselves, first of all, of the environmental problems that we have in Scotland, which are often worst in areas of highest deprivation, where the majority of polluting factories, landfills, incinerators, and other environmental burdens located. And this can produce air, water, and noise pollution. We can also think about proximity to derelict and contaminated land and the attendant health impacts and risks which can arise from that. And other aspects of environmental quality. So we know that environmental stresses are clearly linked to social inequalities and poverty. And across Scotland, for example, if we think about environmental quality, it's important to recognise the disparities in access to green space and areas for recreation and environmental well-being. So there's been a massive reduction in local authority spending on environmental services of like 16% in the past decade. And this is really compounded in areas of highest deprivation, where that can reach as high as 41% decline in spending. And we see this results in an absence of green space where people can go for recreation and leisure, and yeah, declining levels of overall well-being in the population as well. And so, yes, this has real impacts on people, and that is unevenly distributed. Again, it's often children, older people, and people with pre-existing health problems who are hardest hit by environmental harm. And a good example of that is air pollution and how that impacts people who have asthma, people who are younger, or pregnant women, or people with pre-existing health conditions, and how this really impacts their right to health as well. And again, as I mentioned, this is across the board tends to be worse for marginalized groups in terms of the intersection between areas of highest economic deprivation and how that's often racialized, and yeah, proximity to polluting industries, to areas where there's like high levels of traffic and congestion, and poor air quality and environmental quality. And also with the climate crisis in terms of people's vulnerability to severe weather events such as flooding. We know, for example, often it's poor infrastructure and planning means that disabled people will be hardest hit in the climate crisis in terms of being able to evacuate if there's flooding, or in terms of making homes and infrastructure suitable and safe in those situations. And this is what we call distributional environmental injustice. And I wanted to bring up this image because I think it makes it a bit more real when we're talking about environmental rights violations. You've probably heard of Ella's case before, but this is Ella Advocacy who died age 9 in 2013. And a coroner ruled that air pollution made a material contribution to her death. So she died of an asthma attack, but she lives just meters away from one of the air pollution hotspots in London. And her asthma attacks had coincided with spikes in the legal levels of air pollution persistently year after year. Another example in Scotland that I'd like to raise is one around water pollution, and it's rarely a day goes by without sewage pollution in our rivers and seas being in the headlines across the UK. But this isn't only in England that this is happening, it's also very much a live issue in Scotland, and we'll be hearing more from Pippa about this shortly. But you can see here how sewage is also an issue. We have combined sewage overflows, which leave sewage spilling into our waterways. And despite repeated requests for action to enforce licenses, the Environmental Protection Agency in Scotland often has refused to take the requisite action to really address the issues. And a final example that I was going to bring up is access to green space and nature, because this really highlights some of the inequalities across Scotland. So the image here is of St Wittig's Park in Torry in Aberdeen. Torry is one of the most disadvantaged areas in Aberdeen and has often been treated as a sacrifice zone. So around St Wittig's Park, you'll find a refuse dump, an incinerator, and a sewage treatment works, which lies just meters away from a primary school. And now there's a massive community campaign to preserve St Wittig's Park, the last green space in Torry, because it's at risk of industrial development for a so-called energy transition zone. And so despite the rhetoric of a just transition, there is clearly a long way to go. And we can see how the lack of public consultation and refusal to listen to public concerns, which have been vocally articulated, really illustrates how environmental rights have yet to be taken fully seriously or are treated in quite a superficial way. Now, we do have some rights protections in Scotland and across the UK. The Aarhus Convention is a UN treaty which enshrines our procedural rights to a healthy environment. But in Scotland, and indeed all UK nations, are currently in breach of this convention, specifically the access to justice requirements. So the convention protects our right to access environmental information, to public participation in environmental decision-making, and access to justice and environmental matters. But the prohibitive expense of going to court means that most people can't use the legal system to hold public bodies and polluters to account. And consequently, there is no real legal remedy for environmental rights violations. And there's also a failure to really deter some of the worst offenders when it comes to environmental pollution and poor planning decisions, because there's no real sanction when decisions go badly, and people and communities across Scotland are left to pick up the pieces in terms of environmental damage. So these procedural environmental problems, I just want to discuss in a bit more detail, because we know there's a major imbalance of power in terms of exercising our environmental rights. We know that marginalized inequality groups, whose experience is often compounded by poverty, are furthest removed from participation in local decision-making. They're often less aware of their rights, or simply have less capacity and resources to implement them. And as already mentioned, access to the courts has been ruled prohibitively expensive, and Scotland is in breach of the Aarhus Convention. So you can see that the same issues where we face in seeking social and political justice are replicated in accessing justice on the environment. And this results in a poor enforcement of planning and nature conservation law, and also creates barriers to public interest litigation because of the high costs of going to court, which means there's no credible threat of legal challenge and no incentive to really address lax environmental enforcement or improve good environmental practices. And then we see the impact of this with nature destruction across Scotland. So Scotland, despite its image as being a very wild and nature-filled country, is actually 28th from the bottom out of 240 countries and territories when it comes to biodiversity intactness. So in terms of how many species we have in Scotland and how intact the ecosystems are. And we also see massive declines in species. We've seen a decline of losing nearly half of our species since 1970. And 1 in 9 species are threatened with extinction. So these are really major issues which, despite the strong environmental rhetoric in Scotland, have yet to be properly addressed. And of course, we have the climate emergency, and not a day goes by without the effects of that becoming increasingly more evident. So this is the procedural environmental injustice that we witness in Scotland. And the human right to a healthy environment is supposed to help address and rectify some of these issues. I'll just touch on some of these substantive features because I know Elisa already outlined them earlier, but these are all basic features of the right to a healthy environment, and they're not yet part of Scots law. So if they're being violated, it's very hard to seek corrective action from public authorities. And the procedural elements of the right to a healthy environment that I mentioned on previously are in the Aarhus Convention, which Scotland is signed up to, but they have not been fully implemented. And indeed, Scotland is about to miss a vital deadline on the 1st of October for meeting the access to justice requirements of the Aarhus Convention for the 10th year in a row. So there's a real need to push governments in Scotland and across the UK to go further on this. And there is a real interdependence between environmental law and human rights obligations. We know a healthy environment underpins the right to life, which is obviously the cornerstone of all of the other human rights that we hold. And it also is vital for the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to an adequate standard of living. and also the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And we recently had the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child incorporated in Scotland after a very long campaign to do so. But we know that the right to a healthy environment is fundamental for the realization of children's rights, and it's obviously young people and children who will be most impacted by the failure to act on the climate emergency. So we had a promise from the Scottish Government for a human rights bill, which was due to be incorporated in the current parliamentary session. And this was first announced in 2016 by Nicola Sturgeon. We had the National Human Rights Task Force leadership report that Elisa Morgera contributed to, which recommended incorporation of all treaties, including the right to a healthy environment. And then we had renewed commitment from Humza Yousaf in 2023. After a long consultation process, which mobilized many civil society and human rights groups across Scotland, we had Cabinet due to sign off on the draft bill in June of this year. And then recently, the devastating news that the Human Rights Bill had been excluded from the programme for government, which sets out the legislative agenda for the next 2 years. And so this is an incredibly devastating moment, but we're not giving up, and we think it's more important than ever to keep the right to a healthy environment on the agenda. And so while we're extremely worried that the right to a healthy environment is being ditched by the Scottish Government, and we've virtually had confirmation from the Cabinet Secretary that it's too hard to implement despite being incorporated across the world by 164 countries and territories, we can see how this narrative is taking hold. And so it's imperative that we ensure the enjoyment of a clean, healthy and sustainable environment is at the heart of the human rights agenda in Scotland and across the UK. And it matters for all of us now and for future generations. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Benji, and a really important reminder for those of us outside Scotland that there's a huge difference between perhaps the rhetoric we hear from Scotland in terms of all these great protections versus the reality that people are living through. Talking of which, I think we're going to hear a little bit more on that from our next speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Pippa Scott, and Pippa is a co-chair of the River Almond Action Group, a grassroots group concerned with sewage pollution of the River Almond. Pippa has worked professionally in the international water sector for the last 10 years and joined the River Almond Action Group when it was established in 2020, when the issues she worked on elsewhere came to life on her own doorstep. Pippa is also on the board of the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland. And over to you, Pippa.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks so much for the invitation coming here today. And hi, everyone. Let me share some slides. Are you able to see that? Fantastic. So I, as Helen mentioned, I have dedicated most of my kind of early career to that kind of access to clean water and safely managed sanitation. That was my professional focus, often working in low-income settlements in some of the poorest countries in the world. And that was absolutely where my gaze was kind of, fixed for a long time. And then at some point in 2020, I became aware of quite a local uproar around my local river, the River Almond. I live in West Lothian in Scotland, and there was a lot of kind of noise on social media about the state of the river and sewage pollution from residents. And what was happening was, it was during COVID and people were going out to walk in the kind of natural environment, and people were kind of gravitating towards the river and seeing things that maybe they hadn't seen before, or going every day and noticing changes. And what they were seeing was pollution events and sewage debris scattered all over the river. So let me tell you about the River Almond. It's a 45-kilometer river. It comes up in Shotts in Lanarkshire, which is kind of in the central belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and then it flows out east to the sea just outside of Edinburgh at Crammer Beach. all along the kind of lower end to the midpoint of this river is it now has kind of recreational paths. Historically, this river was quite important in the shale industry. It runs through a lot of historic kind of mining towns. And since that mining industry has kind of declined and gone away, the river has developed into this kind of recreational space. It runs through a country park. There are parts of the river where there are kind of play parks and barbecue areas where people will, take their dogs for a walk, children paddle. There's a housing development near me that actually in the kind of housing development brochure, the housing developer put pictures of teenagers playing in the river. And that was the kind of image that was being sold. Come and move out to the country and enjoy this river. I think the reality is that there's millions of liters of untreated sewage dumped into this river each year. Along the river, there are 7 wastewater treatment sites that discharge into the river, and there are 87 combined sewage overflows. What we've discovered since kind of coming together and asking questions is, and from what residents have kind of been vocalizing and telling us, and what they were witnessing in kind of 2020 was, sewage systems are designed that in very heavy exceptional rainfalls, they will discharge into the river to prevent flooding. What residents were clearly seeing was this was happening in dry weather conditions. It was happening on an almost daily basis. And often what was coming out as well was sewage related debris. So toilet paper, sanitation, sanitary ware, a lot of wet wipes, a lot of both sanitary pads and wet wipes are made out of plastic fibers, and they were being discharged into the river. You can see some of the pictures, clinging onto trees and being washed down the river and into the sea. None of this was cleaned up. There was kind of no remedial action to clean it up. And it was quite frequent. If you walked along the river, you'd often see these trees with kind of white wispy things floating in them that once you realize there are basically sanitary towels and wet wipes, it's pretty gross. And what happened when residents started kind of making noise about this and reporting this to SEPA, to Scottish Water, the reaction that was coming back was, oh, don't worry, the system's working as it should. It's designed to work like this, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about at all. And then through kind of a series of Freedom of Information Act requests and asking a few more questions, it became quite clear that actually the SEPA and Scottish Water didn't have answers to the questions, kind of how much is spilling, how often is it spilling, how many pipes are they discharging into the river. They simply didn't have any of the answers, which breaches European law. All of these should be monitored, and they should know exactly when they're coming on and off. And I think it was, there was when kind of the local residents started making a lot of noise about this and complaining, there were a few of us who had some insight into the water industry. My experience of the water industry in the UK was very limited, but I think we recognized when the responses were coming back that there was a huge gap in terms of accountability. There were questions that should have been relatively easy to answer that the statutory bodies were dodging, and the responses that we were getting were actually quite patronizing, and citizens and residents were being pushed from one kind of authority to the other. So a few things that we've done as a citizen group, we're all volunteers, kind of live locally. One of the things that we tried to do with the Forth Rivers Trust and West Lothian Council, the local council, is we had heard a river down in England had done a bathing water application as a mechanism of getting the environmental regulator to actually monitor what's happening in the status of the river. So we identified a stretch of the river for bathing water, and through citizen science and kind of monitoring usage and how many people were actually going in the river, we were able to kind of put in an application for bathing water. That was rejected in part because in theory we hadn't hit a threshold of 150 bathers in that area that we'd identified. We've since, with the help of Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, we've challenged that 150 bathers threshold, because that's not universal across the UK, and that's essentially a threshold that's meant for beach. And we kind of challenged how appropriate it is for a river. But essentially seeking that kind of, trying to use that mechanism, because there were no other available mechanisms, to try and get the environmental regulator to actually monitor what's happening and what the quality is of the water. Because if it was designated bathing water, then the regulator is responsible for monitoring it and checking what's in it. There's no real monitoring outside of bathing water status. Other activities that we've done, we've been involved in citizen science, both testing the water but also monitoring outfalls across the river. Again, that should be readily available information legally, and it's not available. So with the Forth Rivers Trust, again, there was a citizen science activity to try and monitor which of the pipes are discharging. And there are pipes that are discharging in dry weather that we have also tested that are discharging kind of E. coli at source. SEPA will try to convince us that the E. coli may be coming from anywhere, which it absolutely could be, but we've also got point source kind of identification coming out of certain pipes in Livingston. We've set up a stakeholder group. It was very difficult to get dialogue with SEPA, so the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and Scottish Water. There was very much a feeling from the residents' perspective that we were being bounced around between the two, and nobody was willing to kind of take any accountability or answer questions. So with the support of our MP and MSP, Angela Constance and Hannah Bardell, they set up a stakeholder group, which essentially stopped this kind of passing the buck activity and allowed the residents and the grassroots groups, and there's a few of us now who've joined that, to have kind of a seat at the table, and so somebody to kind of call time on that accountability. So that's one mechanism that has helped a little in terms of kind of access to justice and accountability. But again, it's not, it's difficult to move things forward. And we've run various kind of community events and online campaigns to help keep this issue kind of raised. And we're also an advice client of the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland legal advisory, which has been really, really helpful. And I think just in terms of what justice looks like for us, I think primarily, that this vision of Scotland, and certainly kind of, the residents who are swimming, many of which have kind of swam in this river as teenagers, children who are paddling, and who, some days are getting sick, other days aren't. It's difficult to kind of know if it's safe to swim in this river and use it recreationally. I think the people that I talk to would like rivers and oceans that are kind of free of pollution, and to know if it's safe or not to swim. I think that's the kind of overwhelming question that none of the statutory water agencies ever want to tell us if anywhere is safe to swim or not. That requires a kind of a government commitment to end this type of pollution, and a commitment like that takes years to kind of work through. So, we're really looking for that commitment now. So for future generations, they might actually have kind of those kind of blue and green spaces that are free of pollution. And I think, a really big one for this kind of group and for me is there was a huge lack of kind of accountability and transparency about how the statutory water bodies were working and engaging. Why wasn't SEPA really enforcing when there were very clear and regular breaches of licensing, and why, SEPA still currently has no mechanism when there has been a pollution event to get the polluter to pay for any remedial or undertake any remedial activity whatsoever. They CEPA kind of very clearly and openly said that they don't have that available to them, which seems incredible. And I think, you know, just kind of stepping back, I think these two pictures, both of the Almond, both taken by local kind of photographers, some of the fishermen who are down there a lot. This is the Scotland, the vision that maybe people think of, you know, when they think about Scotland. And, you know, this was the Scotland that some of the local residents were seeing every day. And I think it was just that mismatch and realization that the statutory water bodies were not taking any action and didn't actually have the structures to kind of maintain or drive to an environment like that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Pippa, and like what a really vibrant overview of what's happening, as you say, on your back doorstep, and indeed of like that kind of rights holder led campaign, and really recognize that kind of question about how you keep moving it forward. For our final speaker, I am really delighted to introduce Kierra Box, and Kierra is leading on the work on trade and environmental regulations at Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. She has spent the past 8 years working on policy, advocacy and campaigns issues relating to the UK's exit from the European Union and post-Brexit environmental guidance and governance, Previously, Kierra spent 15 years working on a range of policy and campaigns issues across the NGO and charity sector, including around food production, the private rented sector, and benefit reform. She is currently the chair of GM Freeze and on the management committee of the Trade Justice Movement. So over to you, Kierra, please.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much to everyone who's already spoken today. It's been really interesting, and it's really great to have a chance to be around some people concerned both about human rights and about the environment, and doing both of those things at the same time in the same place. So I'm going to try not to be too repetitive here, because I think that one of the first things I was going to go through was very quick potted history of where we've come from. And I think, in fact, others have covered that quite well. So I'll zip through it. So back in 1998, you know, we're talking over 25 years ago, we saw the Aarhus Convention. We saw that agree we should all have a right to a healthy environment. And we saw the UK government agree, sign up to that, and then implement it in the UK in a limited fashion through the Human Rights Act in Westminster, together with the Scotland Act up in Scotland, to try and give us a way of making those EU convention rights mean something. However, we know that, you know, the Human Rights Act was limited to those convention rights like life, liberty, family. It didn't go any further to provide us with ways to make a reality out of a legal right to a healthy environment, and to make a healthy environment make a difference to our lives. And I think that's what others have already really brought to life. So despite signing these two resolutions, 2021, 2022 in the UN, in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, the UK has never really taken any proper steps to implement the convention. And as Helen said, I work for Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We do have our rose-tinted glasses on when it comes to Scotland. And so we have been hugely excited to see conversations and a consultation on an act in Scotland, and feeling very hard done by that we're not having those kind of conversations across the UK. But in fact, even more hard done by when we look across at over 150 countries around the world, we realise they do have this right. They do have ways that it is implemented. It is made real. People can access it. And we don't have those here. So before we look, and I'm just going to take us just across the UK to give you a sense of the picture in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. What should human rights in law mean? What should the impact be? And I think maybe others have covered this implicitly, but it's maybe worth spelling out. Human rights should impact new laws about Westminster at the national level, but they should then make a difference to how local authorities or public bodies from the national right down to the local level implement those laws and ensure they have a bearing on decision making. And they should give people a real framework for linking those decisions, those laws, and their implementation right down to our real lives so that we can benefit from them and we can seek and receive justice when any harms occur. I often think of this in terms of like a right to pie. You know, if we had a human right to pie, it wouldn't be enough to keep saying you all can get some pie and eat some pie. You'd need a pie delivery service. You'd need a number to call when you don't have any pie. You'd need a way to complain if the pie that you are delivered makes you ill or is pie that you can't eat. You know, it's these really tangible things. You should be able to, you know, in a very Johnson-like statement, you should be able to hold your pie, eat your pie. It should make a real difference to your life. It's not just a kind of, ethereal dream up there in the sky. So I was trying really hard not to say pie in the sky there. When we look across the United Kingdom, what we can see is these shared international commitments. They do apply or they don't apply in a similar way across the United Kingdom. However, when we start thinking about the laws and the judicial systems that impact on how those laws play out, what they mean to us, we start to see that there are barriers. We have a different judicial system in Scotland, in Northern Ireland. We see that the ways in which people access support, education, and justice are kind of through a whole number of gatekeepers. So here, you know, very limited number, things like citizens' advice, which always also has a national and a local a different national and local structure in different countries. We have national networks of law centres, we have local networks of human rights advice, and we have other national level bodies like Liberty, the Environmental Law Foundation, those who are here today. When we carry on looking through the picture, we've then got a range of national laws that are developed, that are administrated, that are delivered by our national level governments and departments. A wide definition of a healthy environment doesn't just include those departments I've shown here, so DEFRA, DERA, but also includes, you know, the planning department. It also includes education. It could also involve laws around planning and net zero and industry, which brings a whole variety of other laws and departments into the mix. We then have a range of regulators which also work on a national level and indeed are often split between different aspects of the environment, different kinds of pollution, different kinds of place that we might live, work or play. And then we have a set of watchdogs for each of the nations. So we've got the Office for Environmental Protection, England, we've got Environmental Standards Scotland, we've got interim assessor in Wales at the moment, and a part of the OEP that operates in Northern Ireland. So we've got a situation where we've got UK-wide recognition of an international human rights right, but we're finding its delivery and our ability to really benefit from it, to access it, to really kind of hold that pie and experience it and eat it is hugely varied. It's hugely fragmented. And when it comes to a right to a healthy environment, again, I'm tempted to say that Scotland is reasonably ahead, with a level of consultation ongoing, with conversations about how that might be integrated into law. We've seen English and Welsh NGOs shifting a bit of our focus from resisting Brexit-related deregulation towards considering how to further rights-based protections. But in Northern Ireland, we're very much still seeing the debate focused on achieving proper independence for our existing regulators. So if we did have an Environmental Rights Act for any of us, really, what might that look like? Well, that could look like giving the right to a human, for God's sake, giving the right to a healthy environment legal status, like the other rights in the 1998 Act. We've been working as Friends of the Earth with Wildlife and Countryside Link, with RSPB, with Client Earth to draft and gather support for an Environmental Rights Act that would do just that. It would also set out a process to allow people to access justice if their right to a healthy environment isn't fulfilled, and provide the tools, transparency, access to information, participation, protection from protest that we need to help people challenge threat to a healthy environment. And I definitely don't intend that anyone try and read this here. But as an overview, what that's really trying to do is to put that human right directly into law, to use that UN definition, that UN Environment Programme definition of a healthy environment, something that's broad, but that applies directly to the things we do and to the ways that we, and I keep going back to this, live, work, study and play, the things that we do in our lives, and something that implements that rights by giving duties to public authorities to act compatibly and tells them what they should and shouldn't be doing, and then ties that back in to our national level laws, to the Environment Act, to the targets that national governments are setting under that act for improving the environment, and encourages those local authorities to pay a high level of regard to achieving those outcomes. It then sets out some very specific duties around providing information, routes to participation and access to justice. Again, that really bring this right to life, allow people to enforce it and to defend it and to protect themselves and the environment from harm. I have a whole draft bill. I'm very happy to share it with anyone who would like to read it. But I think maybe the most useful thing to leave you all with now is just some of the questions that came up to me when I was thinking about what the legal right to a healthy environment means internationally, across the UK, nationally, and then down to all of us sitting at our screens right now. So I suppose I was wondering what that patchwork of delivery, of support, of justice, what it means for our lived experience, what it means for our shared human rights to rely on that kind of national level realisation and implementation, and what we can or should be doing to enshrine, to incorporate a definition of a healthy environment into legislation and to make that actually mean something. And how does this all fit into our supranational, our international and our local commitments, our routes to justice, to do what, again, I think other speakers have really referenced, to fill in the gaps, to provide a really holistic understanding of our rights, and to make the most difference possible to our experience of our environment. And finally, in a way that may or may not need to be qualified or restricted in some way, because I'd like a utopian right, and I'd like something that makes the most difference to the most people, but I would also like it to be practicable, to be realizable. And I wonder if we might need to ensure that when we're thinking about a legal right to a healthy environment, we make it workable for everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Kierra. Another absolutely fascinating presentation. I will absolutely be stealing the pie imagery. I loved it.